Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from stolen, unceded Indigenous land. Personally, I'm facilitating on Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present of this land and other lands, and extend to that any First Nations peoples with us today. I'd like to acknowledge that First Nations peoples feel the effects of the climate crisis and nuclear industry first and worst, and that they've been on the front lines of the fight for climate justice and against nuclear colonialism since the beginning. First Nations people are leading the fight to a nuclear-free future, and our work is to support them in any way we can. We need to live this truth and not just acknowledge it with our words. Action is needed to bring into reality a future where First Nations' right to self-determination is realised. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my name is Nellie Stevenson. This forum is hosted by Don't Nuke the Climate. Don't Nuke the Climate Australia campaign offers resources and facts to counter the disinformation around nuclear power that is currently being spread by nuclear promoters. Today, we commemorate 14 years since the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and the people affected by it. So the aim of this event this evening is to share the learnings from the experience with Fukushima, a reactor accident in a rich, technically sophisticated and modern country with high safety standards. In these ways, it's comparable to Australia, except that unlike Australia, Japan has had decades of nuclear experience. If the coalition's nuclear proposal were to go ahead, the risk of nuclear accident is always present, and we're looking what the risk could look like if an accident was to occur in a nuclear power plant in Australia. We'll need a very, very strong community movement in the lead up to the election. We're up against a highly coordinated and well-resourced aggressive disinformation campaign with social media bots and massive right-wing PR firms. We need everyone that cares about future generations and the planet to become an anti-nuclear activist from now until the next election. Australians have resisted the push for nuclear power in the past and have been able to reject these flawed proposals, and we can do it again. So as representatives of the long-standing anti-nuclear movement, we have the expertise, the resources, and the argument to help Australians make an informed decision at the ballot in the next couple of months. So before we go on, I'd just like to welcome our speakers we have this evening. We've got Dr. Tillman Ruff from the Medical Association for Prevention of War. We've got Dr. Jim Green, National Nuclear Campaigner for Friends of the Earth. And we've got Sakio Noda, logistician and translator for the Radiation Monitoring Field Team in Fukushima. So in terms of structure for this evening, first we'll hear from Dr. Jim Green, who will explain what the fallout could look like in the 7 proposed nuclear reactor sites in Australia based on the real-life data we have from research from Fukushima. After that, after Dr. Jim, we'll hear from Sakio Noda. He was a logistician and translator for the Radiation Monitoring Field Team in Fukushima on what they witnessed on the ground after the accident. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Tillman Ruff from the Medical Association for Prevention of War on the health risks around nuclear radiation and accidents. So Dr. Jim Green is going to speak first. He is the National Nuclear Free Campaigner with Friends of the Earth Australia, a member of the Nuclear Consulting Group and former editor of the Nuclear Monitor newsletter published by the World Information Service on Energy. He has an honours degree in public health and a doctorate in science and technology studies for his thesis on the debates over the replacements of Australia's nuclear research reactor. Jim, take it away.
Thank you, Nellie, and thanks, Nellie and Kirsten and others for all the work that's gone into this project. It's been a really big exercise, and it's really exciting to be able to launch it today. So there's the website, nuclearplume.au. Please visit it and show it some love. And this project is basically answering this question: how would a nuclear disaster affect communities around the 7 sites targeted for nuclear reactors by the Dutton Coalition? You can see a map there of the 7 sites. They're all operating or closed coal plants, but we should keep in mind that it's entirely possible that other sites will be targeted around Australia. So what we've done is we've superimposed a Fukushima radiation fallout map over these 7 sites and given people the option to choose the wind direction. And of course, looking at a map like that, that's a site near Loy Yang with radiation spreading far and wide. And obviously the first lesson there is that radiation does spread far and wide. The darker the shading in these maps, the higher the concentration of radioactive fallout, the greater the human exposures, the greater the risks. At long distances from the reactor site, the the radiation exposures are relatively low, but even those low doses carry a risk of causing cancers and other diseases. And also, it's been really interesting. Just in the past few months, there's been revelations about the Fukushima disaster, which was 14 years ago today, about the discovery of radioactive cesium-137 hotspots. And that's written up in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And it just raises a whole question, who knows how much radiation exposure people were subjected to. There's certainly been cover-ups. There's certainly been things in the Fukushima prefecture, like placing radiation monitors in regions where they know that there are low doses, and failing to place radiation monitors in areas where they know that there are high doses. So that's really part of the problem is, what information do you believe? And if you can't believe your own government, well, where do you go? There's been an awful lot of citizen science in Japan, which is really interesting. Anyway, if we zoom into these maps, there's an 80-kilometre radius circle there, and we've included that for two reasons. One is that the US government advised citizens within 80 k's of the Fukushima disaster to evacuate, and also some research from the Australian Parliamentary Library released last year found that nearly 12,000 farms are located within 80 k's of these 7 sites in Australia. And these areas are known as ingestion zones, and there would be a profound impact on agriculture in those regions out to a radius of 80 k's. Now, if we zoom in a bit more to 30 k's, and for a bit of context, after the Fukushima and Chernobyl disasters, there were mandatory evacuations beyond 30 k's, but we've taken a conservative approach with this information, and we've limited the hypothesized evacuation zone to a radius of 30 k's. And these disasters happen, and vast numbers of people are evacuated. It's over 500,000 if you combine Fukushima and Chernobyl. So we've done the research and found that nearly 200,000 Australians would be in these evacuation zones. In Victoria, for example, within 30 k's of the Loy Yang site, there's 83,852 residents. And very importantly, in these 7 sites combined, in this 30k zone, there are 33 hospitals and medical centres, 99 schools and 62 daycare centres. And this is really important. Of course, there's going to be some level of response to this information that says that it's scaremongering. We'll just look at the reality of what happened at Fukushima, a wealthy, advanced industrial country that had decades of experience with nuclear power, and people were left to die in aged care centres, and the evacuation was an absolute shambles. And the death toll from Fukushima is highly uncertain, but one thing that is certain is that at least 2,300 people have died as an indirect result of the disaster because of this shambolic evacuation and because of the mistreatment of evacuees in the subsequent years. So on the website nuclearplume.au, you can see you can find out whether your town, whether your suburb is in an evacuation zone. There's no need for me to dwell on this data, but it's there on the website if you would like to look at it. The health effects, which Tillman will speak to later, the propaganda from the nuclear industry and its acolytes, including the Australian Federal Coalition, is that there have been no deaths or radiation sickness from Fukushima. But that doesn't square with independent expert medical advice from various sources, including the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they estimate increased cancer rates for all solid cancers, for thyroid and breast cancers, for leukemias. And also it notes that those risks increase at quite a significant distance from the reactor as well. Security risk is something I would really like to highlight because it's got so little attention over the years. there has actually been a history of conventional military attacks on nuclear facilities going back to the last century. It's a very important issue, but almost no one knows about it. But of course, we've got a pretty graphic illustration of the risks in Ukraine over the past 2 years after Russia's invasion, where multiple nuclear facilities have been subject to military strikes, including operating nuclear power plants and research centres and waste dumps. It's been frightening, and perhaps Tillman will talk about that a bit later. But this issue has been taken up by the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. And this includes people like retired Admiral Chris Barry, former Chief of the Australian Defence Force. And he says that every nuclear power facility is a potential dirty bomb because rupture of containment facilities can cause devastating damage. And another member of this group, Cheryl Durant, says in the Ukraine-Russia war, both sides are given strategic priority to targeting their opponents' energy systems, and Australia would be no different. So this has very real implications for Australia in terms of risks and costs and the competence of the Australian government, the current government and future governments, and the competence of nuclear regulators. But they're important issues and they can't be just wished away. The financial impacts of nuclear disasters, Chernobyl and $4 trillion disaster, that's 40,000 every Australian citizen. Reactor suppliers will not accept liability for the damage caused by their reactors. Housing shown to fall due to proximity to nuclear plants. If you want to see some references and some information about that, well, just please find this text at nuclearplume.au and you can follow those links. And insurance companies will not insure against nuclear disasters. So where does that leave these 200,000 people in an evacuation zone? I mean, basically they're stuffed and they would need some sort of convincing and equitable solution from the federal government of the day to protect them, their families, to protect their financial impacts. Emergency responses. Again, this gets back to the disaster of Fukushima, where the emergency response was woeful. There really aren't adjectives to describe it. But a group called Emergency Leaders for Climate Action have been very vocal in recent years about climate risks, and they say that nuclear reactors would introduce significant and unnecessary risk to Australian communities and emergency responders, including firefighters who are already stretched by escalating climate-fueled disasters. And for evacuees, 191,000 evacuees from Fukushima. And as I mentioned before, there have been at least 2,300 deaths amongst those evacuees. And a UN special rapporteur noted in a couple of years ago that many displaced persons are unable or unwilling to return to their areas of origin, and that evacuees face challenges in accessing basic rights, including housing, health, livelihood, participation, and education for children. And keep in mind, this is 14 years later. This human suffering is ongoing. The barrage, the avalanche of legal actions are ongoing. The costs, the trillion-dollar costs, are mounting by millions every day. And in a best-case scenario, it will be many decades before they've cleaned up the mess that they created at Fukushima. And Fukushima was not a natural disaster. It wasn't an act of God. It was an act of corruption and incompetence across the Japanese nuclear industry. And that's not just my opinion, that's the conclusion of the Japanese parliamentary inquiry into this disaster. And finally, nuclear waste hasn't got nearly enough attention. If you saw the parliamentary interim report into nuclear power, which was released last week, they spoke at length about the extreme costs of nuclear power and the decades that it would take to introduce nuclear power, but they're silent on safety risks and silent on nuclear waste. It's very important to note that the coalition has clearly and repeatedly acknowledged that they will use these reactor sites for the long-term storage of high-level nuclear waste and intermediate level waste and low-level waste. That waste isn't going anywhere. So if you're signing up for a nuclear reactor, then you're getting nuclear waste as well. And if you have a reactor imposed on you, you will also have these risks associated with nuclear waste imposed on you. In Australia, to summarise 30 years of history in one sentence, there have been many failed attempts to establish stores and repositories for radioactive waste, and they've all failed. Around the world, there is not one deep underground operating repository for high-level nuclear waste. There is one deep underground repository for intermediate level waste. It's in the United States. You would hope that they would manage it well, but they managed it very poorly. And the regulation was grossly inadequate, and that resulted in a number of accidents, including an underground explosion in a nuclear waste barrel, which took 3 years to clean up and cost several $billion to clean up as well. If anyone would like to use this PowerPoint, you're very welcome to. You might want to use it for your own presentations or just to follow up the references. All of this content is available in a different form on the front page of the Nuclear Plume website. And I will leave it there and hand back to you, Nellie.
Dr. Jim Green, thank you very much for that just sobering presentation. It's I've been looking at this stuff all day, working on this with you, and it's still really just quiets the soul to think about what this might look like in Australia. So thank you very much. Oops, for your presentation this afternoon. Our next speaker is Sakio Noda. He is a Sydney-based community organiser. He's been involved in environmental protection and advocacy for international NGOs and community groups. After the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident in 2011, he participated in the field survey program as a logistics member and translator of the Greenpeace radiation monitoring team. He completed a Health Physics Level 5B course at the National Centre for Radiation Protection at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Sakio, take it away.
Thanks, Nelly. Thanks everyone for joining us on the Fukushima anniversary. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land where I'm speaking from tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Before I start my talk, I'd like to let you know that some of the stories I will talk about include people's death and suicide that may be upsetting for some individuals. My name is Sakio Noda. I'm from Japan and now live in Sydney. On March 11, 2011, when the massive earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident happened, I was with my family in Sydney. The scale of destruction caused by natural disasters gave me a huge shock, and my concern grew day by day as the radiation spread from Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactors. I remember that I had a feeling of regret as well. I felt that I could have done more to prevent the accident from happening while I was involved in anti-nuclear campaigns for over 10 years in Japan. Then I got an opportunity to join the radiation monitoring in Fukushima. For me, it was a chance to continue working on the unresolved issue and closely witness the aftermath of the nuclear accident. I'll show some photos now as I go. I flew to Japan 2 weeks after the accident to join the Greenpeace radiation monitoring. Other members were mostly radiation experts from Europe who had experiences working in Chernobyl in Ukraine. They brought as much as monitoring and safety equipment as possible with them. My first trip to Fukushima was like nothing I have experienced before. We drove from Osaka, full of equipment, food, and water. We were wearing a one-piece protection suit and mask in the car, and shut off the outer air circulation. As we approached the region, all I saw was a total disaster zone. The roads were cracked everywhere. Damaged cars were piled up and pushed against the hillside by the tsunami. Fishermen's boats were beached in the middle of rice fields. We followed emergency vehicles and army trucks on our way to Fukushima. We set an alert on the radiation dosimeter to give us a heads up. When the first alarm went off and its high pitch beeped loudly inside the car, it brought home the fact that I really was in the radiation zone. We started monitoring. We wanted to check the radiation levels outside of the 20-kilometer radius evacuation area set by the government, because that's where the people still lived with the fear and the lack of information about radiation. During the 26th of March and the 10th of April, we identified the multiple hotspots with heightened radiation levels in Iitate village and Namie town. Iitate village is about 45 kilometers from Fukushima Daiichi. We reported and urged the government to include those areas to the evacuation zone. But it took nearly 1 month for the authority to implement the expanded evacuation zone. During that time, people in Iitate were unnecessarily exposed to high levels of radiation with potential deadly long-term effects. We continued our survey along the road in the area that was on the downwind side when the Fukushima reactors exploded and released an enormous amount of radiation into the atmosphere. We knew that radioactive particles don't spread evenly, but it spreads by wind and accumulate by a range of geological factors. We checked radiation levels on 3 different heights from the ground: 10 centimeter, 50 centimeter, and 1 meter. Radiation levels are much higher at 10 centimeter above the ground because radiation particles fall on the ground. We also chose to check 50 centimeter above the ground because that's the same level as children, and children are more vulnerable to the damage caused by radiation. We drove around many farming areas. Fukushima was one of Japan's biggest agricultural producers. Widespread radiation contamination means people were not only forced to leave their land, but also many people lost their way to make a living. In late March, when I was out on the field, I heard the sad news about a vegetable farmer. He was a dedicated organic farmer for 30 years, growing different types of vegetables. He was devastated by the damage of his newly built home and the collapse of his shed caused by the earthquake. But he didn't lose all hope because his vegetable field somehow survived and he was keen to continue farming. However, 10 days later, one of his vegetables was put on restriction on sale because of the fear of the radiation contamination. Another restriction was imposed soon after. This time it was on cabbage, which was his main product. The next day, he walked to his cabbage field in the early morning and took his own life. According to his family, he was giving up on Fukushima vegetables and losing hope. His family made it clear that they blamed the nuclear power plant. This is one tragic story. At least 240 people took their own lives in similarly tragic circumstances during his first 10 years following the Fukushima disaster. Another day, we visited one grandma. She was temporarily at her house. Her village was designated as an evacuation zone, and residents were allowed to come back to check their house at certain times. She welcomed us by sharing her pre-Fukushima made pickled vegetables. She said she grew up in the village and talked about how strong the ties in her communities were. There was a festival which started 350 years ago in her village. She said that the festival was the focal point of the villagers and the children preparing for months ahead. She was deeply disappointed that the festival was cancelled that year because most of her community members evacuated to different places, and this meant they couldn't coordinate the festival. She looked extremely lonely and alone. It seemed for her a disturbed community was the most difficult thing to cope with. There was a strong connection to the land, both physically and spiritually, in the countryside of Japan. The very land which had been looked after by many generations won't return to the same conditions for many decades, if not centuries. It is reported that more than 460 people have died alone in tiny prefabricated temporary housing and disaster public housing, where they had been moved as a part of evacuation. 4 months after the Fukushima accident, we moved our base to Fukushima City. We assessed the risk of another radiation leak from the reactors was relatively low, and most radioactive particles had settled on the ground and not in the air anymore. We checked the radiation levels inside our hotel, and it was relatively low. One of the team members suggested that we should check the radiation level around the hotel and around the station nearby. I went along with him, and we found surprisingly high levels of radiation at the corner of a public bicycle parking lot, near drains, under downpipes, at the edge of narrow paths. It was clear that wherever soil and runoff water accumulate, radiation levels were still high. Then I saw a mom and her young daughter walking cheerfully at dusk. The little girl was picking flowers and touching soil as she walked. It was easy to imagine that she put her possibly contaminated hands in her mouth later on. Internal exposure to radiation is more dangerous and the children are more vulnerable. I caught up with them and talked. I tried to be as calm as possible, but I was pretty upset and may have looked alarmed. Then I looked around and realized there were so many people around the contaminated area. Just a typical late afternoon, people shopping for dinner, going home, walking dogs, and little kids running around and playing. There was no way I could talk to every one of them. That was the image I still remember. It still haunts me today. The failure to evacuate them, or at the very least, inform them of the radiation risk, was irresponsible. If there had been no nuclear power plants from the beginning, none of this would have happened. In Japan, we were told nuclear power was completely safe. We grew up being told that nuclear power would never cause serious accidents. There are PR centers to promote nuclear power everywhere in Japan. There was a big sign at the main street of one of the affected towns in Fukushima, which says, "Nuclear power is energy for a bright future." This slogan was chosen at the town's open contest to promote nuclear energy 38 years ago, and this wording was made by a local primary school student. One day, during the monitoring trip, we interviewed the young father of 2 primary school kids. I asked a few questions about what he thinks about ongoing nuclear crisis and safety, if he's getting enough information, and so on. His answer was very typical. He said he simply follows the government's instructions, but he's worried about kids' health. I translated this for one of our radiation experts, and he pointed out that this was an interesting answer because while the man is following what the government says, he's also suspicious of its claim that there is no immediate health risk to people. It seems that some people have finally started realizing it, that government can't assure your health and the nuclear power is never safe. I took this as a light out of darkness. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope that my talk gave you some insight into the very real risks of nuclear power plants. And please remember, many people in Fukushima are still suffering. And I don't want the same tragedy to happen in communities in Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sakio, on behalf of all of us here for your grave, moving, and very courageous sharing of your experience here with us. We appreciate it deeply. Thank you. And so up next is Dr. Tillman Ruff. Dr. Tillman Ruff AO is an infectious diseases and public health physician with particular focus on the urgent planetary health imperative to eradicate nuclear weapons. His work also addresses the broader public health dimensions of nuclear technology. He is Honorary Principal Fellow in the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. From 2012 to 2023, Dr. Ruff was a co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and a Nobel Peace Laureate in 1985. I think I need to clarify that the group was a Nobel Peace Laureate in 1985, but I'm sure Dr. Ruff will correct me. He is co-founder and was founding international and Australian chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also known as ICAN, and serves on the board of ICAN Australia. ICAN was awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Ruff has been active in the Medical Association for Prevention of War Australia since 1982 and is a past national president. He has visited Fukushima 5 times since the nuclear disaster and taught, written, and spoken widely about the ongoing nuclear disaster. Dr. Tillman Ruff, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nellie. I'll just get my slides organised here. Are you able to see those okay? So thanks very much, and thanks to the previous speakers for those really succinct and powerful presentations. I want to talk a bit about the disaster itself and some of the ins and outs and really its implications. It hasn't finished yet by any means, as Sakio has clearly outlined. I want to dedicate these remarks to Kenichi and Hanaka Hasegawa, who live just wonderful farmers, been in Itate village for generations. Was the mayor locally, a dairy farmer, extraordinarily wonderful man who really helped to organise much of the citizens, really affirming their rights after the disaster, and tragically died 4 years ago from a quite possibly Fukushima-related cancer. His area was one of the villages that was not evacuated in a timely way at all, and it was in fact the Greenpeace team who identified how contaminated Itate was, but people lived in one of the most contaminated villages for 5 weeks after the disaster before they even knew there was a problem. This is the last time I was with him there in 2019, and you can see that the radiation monitor's built on a clean spot. Here you just stand next to it and you get a much higher reading, and you go a little bit further away and you get a much higher reading again, double what the meter says. This is, he switched from dairy farming to buckwheat growing, and this is just near his place. This is now 8 years later. This level of radioactivity on the ground is about 25 times the background level, despite the claims of Japanese government that the disaster is essentially over. I think it's very important to acknowledge in Australia that Australia fueled the Fukushima disaster, and in a sense we're very closely bound up with this. Fukushima is everywhere, both in terms of the fallout and in terms of the global web that is the nuclear chain. It was confirmed before the Parliament that Australian uranium was in each one of those reactors that exploded. So it's fallout mined against the deep and abiding opposition of the traditional owners that caused this fallout that's now continuing to cause so much harm in Japan. And Ippon Makarula, the senior traditional owner of the Mirror people where the Ranger uranium mine is, has spoken very eloquently about the distress that they feel for for what's happened from material mined on their country against their wishes. This was a big plant, 4 operating reactors, 2 more over here. Just walk you through some of this. They were old reactors. There was significant corruption involved in the construction of this plant. TEPCO chairman actually had to resign. There was falsification of records and safety data. A massive amount of fuel, almost 10 times that in the Chernobyl reactor, most of it in the spent fuel pools, so no containment, just in a big shed sitting on top of the reactors. Reactor 3 was actually loaded with plutonium-enriched fuel, so a particular risk in terms of the fallout. And those damaged plants are continuing high vulnerability to further seismic events. It was a really big earthquake. That day was actually shorter by a couple of microseconds. The Earth actually sped up. 500,000 people were evacuated, and the radioactive problem it worsened what was already a severe disaster from the earthquake and tsunami. The fallout began after the earthquake and before the tsunami hit, unlike much of what the government and TEPCO proclaim. And although a massive earthquake, not so unusual. There were 11 earthquakes of that size last century. There have already been 5 in this century, most of them followed by tsunamis. And tsunami run-ups pretty much as big as the ones we saw in Fukushima. You can meet old people in Fukushima who can remember this run-up in 1933, when tens of meters of sea run-up. So it's not an unexpected event. It was obviously cataclysmic in terms of the wave that hit, that flooded essentially all of the infrastructure, knocked out pretty much all of the control and cooling equipment. These were the seawater pumps to cool the reactors, flooded all the electrical control rooms, and then followed by a series of explosions in reactors 1, 2, and 3 that sent vast plumes of radioactivity. And produced a decimated, really dangerous, highly radioactive site, very difficult to clean up. Heroic but really extraordinary emergency improvisation to dump cooling water through the broken roofs on the damaged reactors using fire trucks and helicopters. But an absolute mess. Repeated spikes of radioactive releases as these explosions occurred, and very strong evidence that the releases began before the tsunami hit, that the Diet Commission that Jim referred to mentioned. The cesium, we are actually extremely lucky that it wasn't worse, because on the night of the 14th of March, when actually the highest emissions plume went over Japan, luckily it didn't rain. Had it rained on that night, it's quite possible that Tokyo might have needed evacuation. We're very lucky that this wasn't an awful lot worse. When the Prime Minister at the time was asked about what was the worst case scenario, it was a spent fuel pond dry fire when it ran out of cooling water. And Naoto Kan, and in fact, 4 other living Japanese Prime Ministers have spoken against this nuclear power path that Japan has embarked on, and how lucky it was that it wasn't an awful lot worse. This is the fallout that we saw northwest and then southwards, including significant dusting of Greater Tokyo with its population of 36 million people. Can you imagine trying to evacuate them? This is the commission that Jim mentioned. This is one of the best pieces of thorough, independent assessment of what went wrong, and it's absolutely scathing in its findings. It's still one of the best public investigations that I'm aware of anywhere. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, who chaired that, was really clear. This was a human-made disaster that should have been prevented. Bureaucrats put organisational interests ahead of their duty for public safety. Really scathing stuff. It was the result of collusion between government regulators and TEPCO. Damage was not only caused by the tsunami, but earthquakes, so has implications for all nuclear power plants, not just those near the sea, but as many of them are. And that government really failed to act to protect the public. Really extraordinarily blunt conclusions, disregard for public safety. And what's happened since? Kurosawa-san has spoken about this several times since, and basically not much has changed. In his view, that collusive, corrupt relationship continues. One of the things I was really upset about at the time was that the Japanese government arbitrarily increased the maximum permissible acceptable radiation limit for the most vulnerable in the population, young children, from 1 to 20 millisieverts per year, essentially with no reasonable justification, and clearly to reduce the need for evacuations and reduce the cost of the disaster in terms of compensation payments. No other government has accepted such high levels on an ongoing basis for all its population, including the most vulnerable. Even in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, the Chernobyl disaster was managed better than this. And that level of 20 millisieverts per year is still the benchmark for when support has been withdrawn and people are expected and encouraged to return to contaminated areas. You know, in Chernobyl, if you were in an area where you were likely to receive more than 5 millisieverts per year, not 20, but 5, you actually had to be resettled. Why does this happen? And it's through corrupt and collusive relationships that I think we're seeing, and the kind of misinformation we're seeing now in Australia. Industry has been deeply corruptly involved in radiation protection standards and those who set those standards in Japan. This is from the Diet Commission report. TEPCO presidents trying to influence research about radiation health. We're seeing some of that sort of misinformation here, and a continued prosecution of absolute misinformation by Japanese government agencies that less than 100 millisieverts of radiation have no proven health harm, which is demonstrably false. The one population-based study that I'm aware of where a substantial number of people actually had radiation dose monitoring was in the city of Date, which is actually more than 50 kilometers away from the plant. And as good Japanese do, they tend to be obedient, and 80% of the city's 65,000 people wore these badges for a year. And the estimated doses in terms of lifetime projection for these were not a few millisieverts, but tens of millisieverts, with doses up to over 100. And interestingly, the people living in areas that had been decontaminated didn't have significantly lower radiation exposures than those living in areas that hadn't been decontaminated. These data get very little discussion, but I think they're extremely salutary. The disaster is not over yet, and I'll just highlight some of the ways in which, contrary to the Japanese government's claims, it poses a continuing source of radioactive leakage and extraordinarily difficult to manage, with risk of further releases from further earthquakes or tsunamis or worse. But contaminated water that leaks from the bottom of the plants into the soil and the seas has been a major continuing problem, with this vast accumulation of contaminated cooling water on site, which is now being discharged into the ocean. I think a deeply regrettable and I would argue illegal step. The kind of makeshift haste within which a lot of this was constructed is really salutary. There were many reports of serious leaks of radioactive water. In one case, cooling water for the 4 spent fuel pools was failed for 30 hours because one rat chewed a key cable in a switchboard. That's the kind of vulnerability that this site still represents. Massive problems with leakage, which is one of the reasons why they've been so keen to get rid of the problem and dump it at sea. Radiation moves in the environment. There've been soil in rice paddies documented with higher levels of radioactivity than would classify them as nuclear waste. Similarly, in beach sands in some parts of the province, 8,000 is the limit for what's considered nuclear waste. Much higher levels have been identified. And The continuing leakage is demonstrated by there's essentially no drop in the levels of various radioactive materials in the sea near the plant, and also in the fish. If the contamination stopped, you would expect these levels to decline much faster than they are, but particularly freshwater fish and bottom living fish in blue are the ones that are the most radioactive. And also radiation is not a simple thing. Many radioactive substances are concentrated up the food chain. So the concentration in a fish, for example, might be hundreds or thousands of times higher than the concentration in the water that the fish swims in. And you can see that these concentration factors, both in water and in sediment, can be orders of magnitude for different important isotopes. Radioactivity can move in various ways, including through organisms higher up the food chain. This is a map of radioactive tuna found off the coast of California, contaminated by Fukushima radioactivity. The same will apply to turtles and seabirds and sea mammals. Severe criticism of Japan's practices, many aspects of the disaster management and mismanagement by multiple UN special rapporteurs on human rights, and deep protests from many Pacific Island nations in particular, as well as nations surrounding Japan about the wastewater discharge, which is now underway. This is a table that looks at the cancer risk for the same dose of radioactivity, depending on how old you are at the bottom, and differentiated by biologically male or female. Girls are in yellow, boys are in blue. And you can see a couple of things. One is that there's a huge increased vulnerability of women and girls to the adverse cancer-inducing impacts of radiation for the same dose as men and boys, about 40% higher and greater the younger you are. And also that there's this huge age gradient. Where I am, it almost hardly matters anymore. The people who are really at risk are my grandkids, right? Their risk for a given dose of radiation is at least 5 times higher than mine. They're the ones who need particular protection. So where would you expect to see an impact in children? Unfortunately, the health outcomes of the Fukushima disaster have been very poorly monitored, I think deliberately so. The one exception has been thyroid ultrasound monitoring for early detection of thyroid cancers in children. And there's a clear smallish epidemic compared with the Chernobyl one, but about 400 cases or so far, with a clear gradient by level of contamination, which has essentially been denied by authorities. And in fact, the screening program has effectively been shut down. But in various reports and analyses, in different ways, you can see such a very clear gradient in such health impacts. Sorry, it's just being slow to move. So let me finish, if we have time for maybe leave some time for questions. This is just, people are not the only beings affected. I'll just really quickly show you that the data that we have show that animals are also profoundly impacted. This is the abundance of birds dramatically reducing as the background radiation goes up in Fukushima in the years after the disaster. This is the number of species also going down dramatically as the radiation dose goes up. Rates and types of abnormalities in butterflies that had not previously been observed before. Growth abnormalities in conifers, Japanese fir trees, which are particularly radiation sensitive among plants. A dramatic reduction in species diversity and numbers of everything that lives in the intertidal zone, the shellfish, mollusks, all kinds of animals, the closer you are to the disaster site. Low blood counts related to the radiation dose in wild monkeys, and smaller brain sizes in monkeys with higher levels of contamination. We're not unique, and we ignore these kinds of signals from the rest of the biological world absolutely at our peril. If you live next to a nuclear power plant, this is data from the US, you get more radiation. This is essentially dose by distance because of the many hundreds of different isotopes that come out of routine emissions, even apart from an accident. This is routine settings. The best data about those particularly vulnerable is children and leukemia comes from Germany, where a study, a really good national government-supported study, showed that the risk of getting leukemia was more than doubled for a child living within 5 kilometres of any of the normally operating 16 German power plants. And that risk didn't go back to baseline until 50 kilometres away. This is normally operating reactors. Fukushima and Chernobyl might seem like exceptions to the rule, but if you look at the historic frequency of reactor accidents, there have been at least 20. I think, I'm not confident that all of them are well reported, but there have been at least 20 accidents where the core has been damaged. And in fact, for those with significant public exposure to radiation, it's actually the same number, not all exactly the same. All different types of reactors in different countries. Core melt accident in the current nuclear power reactor fleet globally is about 1 in 1,300 reactor years. For the early type of reactor that was constructed in Fukushima, the risk is actually double that. With that frequency in a reactor fleet of 50, as Japan had pre-disaster, that's one of these core melt accidents that you would expect every 12 years. So this is not an unusual or unexpected event, and this is based on historic frequency of events. If you have multiple power plants within a concentrated area, such as is being proposed in New South Wales and Queensland, then those risks overlap and add on top of each other. We have some new risks that we haven't seen before. The weaponization, the attacks on and attacks from operating nuclear power plants, an extraordinary risk that we're seeing at all of the nuclear facilities in Ukraine, with a global community that's been unwilling to strengthen the measures to prevent that use in conflict. Cyber attacks are a reality on nuclear infrastructure these days, and drone attacks is something to which all nuclear facilities are vulnerable. These are essentially pre-positioned dirty radiological weapons with profound security risks. So thank you very much. I hope that's provided a helpful perspective on risks that we really don't need to embark on in this country, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tillman-Ruff. I feel like we almost need to come off mute and give a round of applause from everybody, but I don't quite know how to do that in this context. But yeah, I think on behalf of everyone here, I just want to deeply thank all of the speakers. We've heard about the intricacies and complexities, risks, and incredible corruption leading up to and after the Fukushima disaster from Dr. Tillman just now. Sakio Noda courageously shared his very human observations and stories from people on the ground at Fukushima, but particularly the children. I'm sure there are many other parents here like me who felt those stories very profoundly. We've also heard the reality of the risks that Australia now faces from Dr. Jim Green, and for the first time, we as Australians now have the ability to see what these risks look like for us. And a reminder, you can visit those maps yourself at nuclearplume.au, and I'll ask someone to drop that into the chat. But this is why these stories that folks have shared this evening with us, why it is so important to speak out against nuclear power. As I mentioned earlier, it is up to all of us to become anti-nuclear activists between now and the election. We need to speak to friends and family, share those plume maps, have a look of how and where it may impact your community. I personally live over 3 hours away from the proposal in the proposed nuclear reactor in Gippsland, and there is radiation across my community and across the school that my son goes to over 3 hours away. And it's those stories that will help change minds. It's those personal stories and how it will affect each and every one of us if we take this extraordinary risk that Dutton is imposing on us. And it really is conversations that change people's minds, not necessarily facts, even though these facts are mind-blowing, but it's the personal stories that you can tell to the people around you about why you're passionate about this and why you don't want this as a future for Australia and why Australia's future is renewable. It is not radioactive. If anyone has a question that they didn't get answered, you can go to the Don't Nuke the Climate website and look at the myth busting section. And if it's not answered there, you can also send it to don'tnuketheclimate@protonmail.com, and we will do our best to get the answer back to you. Once again, huge thank you to all of our presenters this evening for such powerful, moving, and courageous sharing of stories with us here this evening. Thank you very much. And thank you so much to everyone who attended. Have a lovely evening.